Well, let's get started, and people will join us as they can join us. I'm Father Jim Martin. I am editor of Outreach.Faith, which is the LGBTQ Catholic resource. I'm very happy to welcome you to our third Outspoken webinar series, where we talk about topics of interest to LGBTQ Catholics. So far, we've had Father Bill McNichols, the iconographer and priest. And last month we had Father Brian Massengale, the Fordham theologian. We are very happy tonight to have with us Sister Luisa Derouen. We've just been talking about the pronunciation of her name. And so there are multiple pronunciations. I'm going to do a brief introduction of her, but I'm joined by my colleague, Ryan DeCorpo, who is the managing editor of Outreach and will soon, he was a former O'Hare Fellow at America Media, a graduate of Fordham University, and a soon-to-be master's graduate in journalism from Northeastern University in Boston. So welcome, Ryan.
Thank you.
So Sister Luisa Derouen is a Dominican sister who has been working with transgender people since 1999. She's also been in its brief history. You've been doing this ministry longer than we have. In the brief ministry of Outreach, has been a real great friend to us and a contributor. And I really would say in the United States, probably one of the leading voices in the Catholic Church for ministry to transgender people. And let me just say from a personal standpoint, a friend and also someone who I've really learned a lot about the transgender community through. But Sister Luisa is always the first one to point us to the experiences of transgender people themselves. And oftentimes when we will ask her to write something, she'll say, oh, well, why don't you ask so-and-so who's actually a transgender person to write for you. So we're very happy to have you with us tonight, Sister Luisa.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So I think the very first question that people will want to know, and Ryan and I can go back and forth, is tell us a little bit about how you got started in this ministry.
I'm happy to do that. In 1999, I was finishing, I had had a year, a kind of a sabbatical year. I had just finished being vocation director for my congregation for the second time around. And as I was praying about where was the fire in my belly, did I feel God was calling me? I felt that God was calling me to do gay lesbian ministry. I have gay lesbian people in my family, as we all do. And I've had gay lesbian friends my whole life. And I think that's where God was calling me. But I didn't know any gay people in New Orleans. So I started going to PFLAG meetings there. It was a very active and large chapter of PFLAG. And it was at about the third meeting that I met Courtney Sharp, the first transgender woman I met, with whom I remain very good friends till today. When she walked in the meeting, everybody applauded and said, oh, yeah, oh, it's good to have you back. And I thought, what the heck is this? Well, she had just had surgery. And it was very clear that people loved her and respected her. And this is the first time I had ever met a transgender person. So after the meeting, I asked if we could meet. So she came to my house and she was telling me her story. And I was resonating and I was listening attentively. She's a very quiet, introverted, deeply spiritual, deeply philosophical woman, and highly educated. She has a couple of engineering degrees. So as she spoke and I responded to her story, at one point she just leaned back in her chair and she pointed her finger at me. And she said, you get this. You get it. And she said, this was so early on, 1999. And she said, very few people get this. And she said, for many of us, this is a profoundly spiritual journey, but we don't have spiritual people who understand us, who will walk with us in this journey. And that's how I began. And then it was through Dawn Wright, the next person who was a friend of Courtney's, that I really did understand God was calling me to this ministry. she was very much in the throes of, Courtney had already transitioned and knew herself and was at peace. Dawn was not. Dawn had attempted suicide and would more times. I walked her back from suicide. Dawn is the one that God really confirmed this call to be with transgender people. That's how it began. And then over the course of the years now, 24 years later, I have ministered nationally to somewhere between 250 and 300 transgender people individually, one-on-one, not met them in a group, individually. It's been great privilege.
So is it right to say that most of your ministry, for people that might not be familiar with it, is one-on-one? So is it kind of also in groups and directing retreats and things like that, or is it more one-on-one, or is it a mix?
Yeah, it's a mix. It was very much a mix. It was a lot of one-on-one, but I belonged to a missionary congregation for 47 years of my 61 years in religious life. And so our MO was to go where people are. So it's not like people came to me and sat in an office and we had an appointment. That's not the way it was. I would go out to dinner with them, go have a drink, go to breakfast, go to the wedding in their family. So it was a lot of one-on-one, but it was a lot of group things. I've been to tons of trans support group meetings. I've done a lot of mediating with their families. And even in all the years that I needed to be under the radar, I did find ways to advocate for them and kind of educate and help people understand. I had lots of transgender panels where I would invite, if this was never an open thing, I would invite people I knew wanted to learn, had the right heart, and where my trans friends would be safe. And so just have a 2-hour session and they would tell their story and have Q&A. I did that many times. So it was a mix of all of that.
Ryan, you want to jump in?
Sure. When you said that you first began this ministry with transgender people in 1999, and that was obviously a very different environment as we have now, but in some ways it was very similar. I was wondering if you could describe how the environment, both in secular society and in the church, was either different or the same than what we have now, and what kind of pushback you might have experienced from religious circles.
Okay, yes. Well, in 1999, this was definitely not under the radar of the bishops of the hierarchy at all. They were very much breaking out in hives over gay lesbian issues. The transgender issue was not on their radar. And culturally, certainly, trans people were beginning to come out. Yes, there certainly had been, trans people, famous athletes coming out before Caitlyn Jenner. But still, across the board, there were not a lot of people who had ever met a transgender person. So it was tricky for me because, we vowed religious cannot work in a diocese anywhere on the planet without a bishop's permission. And that's understandable. And so it was really rocky for me with a couple of bishops when I was in their diocese, because they thought I was ministering with gay and lesbian. It was hard to jump those hoops. But it was nothing like it is now. Now people are much more aware. People were not aware then.
Well, let me follow up with that. When you say now, does that mean now it's worse or now it's better in terms of the church and the bishops and dioceses?
Well, in terms of bishops and dioceses, it's worse because predictably, understandably, and I knew this from the very beginning, that someday transgender people would get on the hierarchy's radar. And when that would happen, they would be targeted. That would be dangerous. And I knew the day was coming, and the day came. But better, I mean, the visibility, the social visibility, and church, as more people got to know transgender people, then there was more understanding, there was more support, there was more advocacy. So really, the development was on two tracks all along. In some ways, things were getting worse, but in some ways, things were getting better because they were more known.
I'm wondering, Sister, despite, as you described, the bishop's discontent or discomfort with this issue, if you have a sense of what most Catholics sitting in the pews feel on transgender people, is the American Catholic populace, lay people, mostly supportive?
That has been my experience, Ryan. Now, it could well be that people are being respectful of me and not saying what they really think. But over the years, when I have felt safe enough to say what I do to people, now there again, it's in that context. When I would say I minister in the transgender community, the most common responses from people were, "Oh my gosh, wow, I didn't know anybody in the Catholic Church did that. Oh, wow, I could never do that, but I'm so glad you're doing that." That was kind of most people's response.
The USCCB document, and Jim will speak more on this soon, that was released over the past couple of days, talks about moral discernment in cases of transitioning, in cases of surgical procedures that were now known as gender confirmation surgery. How do you respond to Catholics and other people who have concerns about surgical procedures or do not understand why some people would opt for them?
Well, what's most basic to understand is that this is not primarily a moral issue. It's a biological issue. It's a medical issue. People don't choose to be transgender. The vast majority of people don't know that our brain is gendered as well as our genitals. And that this is not a choice any more than being gay and lesbian is a choice. And I always tell people when they feel, well, they're doing something wrong, they're sinning against God, this can't be right, what they're doing. I tell them about all the holy transgender people I know. I tell them about Dawn. I tell them about Courtney. I'll tell them about Maureen. I tell them stories of the people I know who are so holy and who love God as much as I do, or you, or the Pope. But this is their reality. This is who they are. And they are honoring their truth. And my mantra to transgender people and to others has always been, in all these years, when we seek the truth, we are closer to God, not further away from God. The truth never will lead us away from God. It leads us to God.
Let me follow up on, yeah. Let me follow up on that a little bit. You've talked about the experiences of transgender people and wanting to share them with other people. And you wrote an article about this on Outreach for us, but what would you most like Catholics to know about transgender people? What are the biggest misconceptions, and what do you wish Catholics knew about the transgender community?
What I want people most to know is that this is a profoundly spiritual journey for them. Whether they identify explicitly as religious or spiritual or not, it is a profoundly spiritual journey, because the most fundamental spiritual question is, who am I? Who am I? And all of us, and what I want people to understand is that in some ways, the transgender person's journey is unique, but in many ways, it's not unique. It's the same journey of human and spiritual maturity and conversion of life and transformation in God that we all experience. That's the common experience. For many of us, the context of our deepening growth in God and spirituality it's always a crisis of some kind. It's going to be a crisis. It's going to be something we don't choose that makes us go deeper and know ourselves better, know God better. It may be a death in the family. It may be cancer. It may be a divorce. It may be a hurricane that destroys your home. For transgender people, the primary, most profound context of their transformation in God, in truth, in the integrity of their lives is being transgender. So the process that they go through is not totally far. Medically, it's complex. Spiritually, it's not complex. They are seeking the truth of who they are in the same way that all of us must and do if we are to mature.
Let me just remind people that you can put your questions in the chat for questions for Sister Luisa, and that also, for those of you who missed the beginning of this webinar, we'll be posting it later on. Ryan, do you want to jump in?
Sure. The Vatican, over the past couple of years, and even in recent weeks with Pope Francis, has consistently decried what they call gender ideology. And that is the term that the Vatican uses for a series of ideas the Vatican claims leads people to adopt a quote-unquote transgender lifestyle. In your experience ministering with transgender people, are their choices the result of a gender ideology?
Absolutely, positively not. Or their decisions involved in the process. Yes, there are many, many, very significant, profound decisions and choices they have to make. Are they going to come out? Who are they going to come out to? How will they come out? There are many, but whether they are transgender, that is not a choice. Right from the very beginning, when I started in 1999, this was the narrative that was beginning to come from the hierarchy, what is now termed gender ideology. And there are several components of that has been consistent through all these years. And all of those components were in this statement that came out yesterday from the Doctrine Committee. One of them is that we are male. God, what they say often is Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. God created us male and female. At birth, we are male or female. That's who God called us to be. That is our person. It cannot be changed. That is irreversible. It's permanent, period. And now they talk a lot about it. Yet in the document yesterday, they kept saying the fundamental order of the human body. The fundamental order, well, that's what they mean. Your genitals at birth, that's who God willed you to be. And so then following from that, that's the most basic premise. So following from that, another one of the tropes of gender ideology is that, well, then people who think they are transgender, God doesn't make transgender people. There's no such thing as transgender people. And so people who think they transgender, they're delusional or they're psychotic, or at least they're selfish and superficial. Another part of that narrative is that transgender people, who think they are, but they really aren't, they are trying to play God because they think they have absolute power over their own bodies, and they can choose to be male or female. They can choose their sex based on, and many bishops have said this in their diocesan policy, based on superficial feelings and wants. Okay. And so they're playing God by thinking they can choose to be male or female. Another one of the tropes that concerns the hierarchy greatly is that they are trying to eliminate sexual differences, or at least they're blurring the lines between sexual differences. And you absolutely cannot do that because that threatens the basis of society, which is the family. And so these people who think they are transgender are a threat to the very basis of culture and society. And then part of it is as well, which relates directly to yesterday's statement from a healthcare perspective, is that people who claim to be transgender because of their selfish feelings and wants irresponsibly choose to destroy healthy sex organs. So those are the primary refrains. That's the primary narrative of what the bishops are referring to when they talk about gender ideology.
Well, let me ask
Oh, Jim, yeah.
let me ask you a follow-up question. So you've just explained the thinking, or at least what is called gender ideology, and how it is explained, and that can sound very persuasive to people. So what would your response be to some of those ideas? And I know you say that people are not transgender because of buying into an ideology.
Right.
Which, yes, I mean that is the transgender experience. But what response do you have to people who say, for example, look, people are born with certain genitalia and therefore they're a man or they're woman. People who are born a certain sex, therefore they're man or woman, and this seems to be the way that God has created them. So why would they go against that? What would your response to some of those arguments be? And take as long as you want, because I know that there are a lot of complicated arguments and there are many different levels of them. So
yeah, okay, I can do that. What I want to add before I say that is that package, that narrative that I just described from the hierarchy, the conclusion to that is because transgender people are sinning and they're doing all these bad things, because of that, that's why they suffer depression, mental illness, drug and alcohol abuse. They lose their family, they lose their job, they harm themselves and commit suicide. So that's the full narrative. Those propositions, therefore, because they're doing all those things, this is what happens to them. You see, this is what happens to these trans people. Okay, so how do I respond? Because it definitely comes across, it can easily and does come across as very convincing. If people have a clean slate and don't know transgender people themselves, it can be very convincing. So how do I respond to that with people? First of all, I am not a doctor. I am not a philosopher. I'm not a theologian. I'm a spiritual director and a pastoral care minister. But, but after 24 years, you do have to learn some of this. So I hope I'm being accurate in what I'm saying here, because I'm not a doctor. But most of us think, male, female, XX, XY. That's what we're taught in our science class in school. Okay, you're either XX or XY, chromosomes, male, female. Well, the biology books have said for many decades, there are lots of people who have XXY chromosomes or XXXY or XYY or XYYY. There are many kind of intersex conditions. So being a human being, our physical human body is not nearly as simple as we're inclined to think it is. And I often give one example of Dee Dee, one of the first transgender women I knew, who was identified male at birth, got married, had 2 children, had a perfectly normal male body, but knew her brain was female. And she struggled all her life till in her 50s and then transitioned. Okay. I knew her right at the beginning of all that. Okay. About 5 years ago, she had abdominal cancer. So they go in to do surgery. And what do they find? A uterus. So her genitalia were perfectly male. So why? Okay. But her internal genitalia were not perfectly male. Sex, what I tell people often, sex determination is more complicated than looking at genitals. Sex determination is based on sex chromosomes, gonadal hormones, internal genitalia, external genitalia, and gender identity, brain gender. Those are 5 components of determining sex, somebody's sex. Now, for most of us, all 5 of those components line up. But for a lot of people, they don't all line up. And so it's not as simple as we think medically. Then I always say about the feelings thing, that's very confusing. A lot of transgender people do say, I feel like I'm male, or I feel that I'm female. Well, when we hear the word, I feel like, our experience of that is emotional feelings. I feel angry, I feel sad, I feel happy, I feel emotion. But that is not what transgender people are talking about. What they are referring to when they say, I feel I'm man or woman, it's the brain signal they are experiencing. But many of them, trans people themselves, don't have that language to be able to explain what I'm describing as a feeling is a brain signal that I cannot control or dismiss. Let me tell you, after 24 years, and I tell people this, I give them examples. It's to talk about people's real lives, it's real lives, it's real people. This is not an issue. As they say, an issue doesn't walk through the door, a person walks through the door. And so I give them examples of how transgender people, particularly in my earlier years, before internet was well established, I've known so many transgender people who thought they were the only one in the whole world who felt this way. Can you imagine what that would be like to live decades of your life thinking nobody else in the whole world experiences themselves as different from what everybody else says? And so I give them examples of how transgender people struggle to not be transgender. It's not a feeling that they can get over, Okay, so it's a brain signal. Okay. Then I try to help people understand that when the bishops say you can't separate sex and gender and body and soul, and that's what transgender people are trying to do. They're trying to separate body and soul. And I tell people what trans people are experiencing and doing is precisely the opposite. We aren't only a body, we are a soul, we are a whole person. And transgender people are trying to honor their bodiliness, their sacred bodiliness. Who am I, God? Who am I, God? I want to be who you want me to be. Who am I, God? And so their desire, their effort that people can't begin to imagine is to honor the bodiliness that God gave them, to reverence, not to dismiss, but to reverence their bodiliness. And they're not trying to destroy sexual differences. They're trying to be true to who they are. Again, it's not an ideology. They're not trying to solve an ideological issue about theoretical bodies. They are trying to survive day to day in their own life.
Sister, that's very helpful. Let me ask you a follow-up question I would imagine a lot of people would ask, which is, I think the intersex examples are very compelling to people, and I think people these days are just getting to know that. And so maybe some people would say, well, that part I understand. Someone who, has these internal organs or is, I don't know the right word for it, but has, maybe ambiguous genitalia at birth. But what about for the person who is, say, fully male or fully female physically, doesn't have those other attributes? Can you take us through, maybe since you've ministered to so many people, can you take us through what a person's sort of journey would be let's say they're a person who is, say, fully physically male or fully physically female, and they start to sort of recognize these things about this sort of discontinuity. Can you just take us through I know there's never an average journey, but in your experience, how these things sort of unfold for a person?
Yes, yes. Oh gosh, there would be so many examples that I could give. I'm going to start off and say a little bit about Dawn, whom I mentioned earlier. She was the second person I met who was in a very, very fragile place. I spent thousands of hours with just Dawn herself over 2 decades. In the early years, when she knew since before she started school that she was a girl. She was born with a male body, but she knew in her head she was a little girl. What happens to many of them is that the trauma doesn't start till they go to school. And then, okay, so she went to school, Catholic school, first grade, and the teacher says, okay, line up, the boys here, the girls there. So Dawn, who was a little boy, Dawn, lines up with the girls because he's a girl, first grade. And the teacher says, oh, no, dear, you're in the wrong line. You belong in this line. But he said, but no, I belong in this line. And so the teacher says, no, I'm going to send you to Father O'Reilly. And so, she, little boy, got sent to Father O'Reilly because he was not wanting to be in the boys' line. He wanted to be in the girls' line. And Father O'Reilly took out the paddle and whipped him and said, now this is going to teach you that you better thank God you're a little boy and be glad you're not a girl. Be glad you're a boy and not a girl. And this is going to help you remember. God, whap, 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 whap. Okay, first grade. So this happened 3 times. Later in middle school, another encounter with a priest because she is struggling. I'm really a girl. Okay, adulthood, it happened the same time. Now, what she would say to me often when I met her and began to work with her, she would say, the big issue for Dawn was God. It was religion. She had a therapist who understood transgender issues perfectly, but the therapist wasn't attuned to the spiritual, religious issues. And the therapist never caught on. This was the key, because Dawn would tell me, if I don't transition, I'm going to commit suicide. I can't go on. If I don't transition, I'll commit suicide. But that's a mortal sin and I'm going to go to hell. But if I do transition, that's a mortal sin and I'm going to go to hell. Okay? Finally, after 20-something years, Dawn, I could never convince her that God loves her, made her as she is. She can't be otherwise. She needed the Pope. She needed the bishop to tell her it's okay for you to be transgender. And so that I just kept saying that's not going to happen. But the people of God are the church, One other quick example is Maureen. Maureen, I met about maybe 6 years ago or so. And she was in her 60s, had same struggle since childhood, knew she was trans, very devout Catholic, and fought it her whole life. And as a result, had multiple medical problems, serious, severe medical issues. They could never find a physical reason for why she was having all these physical problems. Well, as it turns out, it's because of her trans trauma and dysphoria. And one of the things that Maureen is definitely reconciled with God, but she would say to me, and I remembered that always, there is no life in me without Christ at the center, but there is no me without transitioning.
Within the past year, we've seen a variety of documents on sexuality and gender identity be released by Catholic dioceses. These are policies aimed at Catholic schools, but they're also aimed at the diocese as a whole. And I just want to read a brief paragraph from the Diocese of Sioux Falls, South Dakota, that just came out, and see how you would respond to this. They say that recognizing the potential scandal, excuse me, recognizing the potential scandal and confusion of the faithful regarding church teachings, those who choose to live a transgender lifestyle publicly and declare such as his or her intent in either word or action may not serve as lectors, extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion, religious education instructors, council members, or in any advisory positions carried out on behalf of the parish. They also say that confirmation and baptism should be delayed to transgender people. They cannot serve as bridesmaids or groomsmen in weddings, and they cannot serve as baptismal or confirmation sponsors. How do these policies reflect any sort of welcoming stance for the church, or are these dioceses not really trying to welcome transgender people at all?
I don't believe they're trying to welcome transgender people at all. Many of these dioceses, I don't know specifically which ones, but I know that many of the dioceses have used as their primary consultants a group entity called Person and Identity Project. And they are a subsidiary or a part of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, which is a conservative think tank. It's not even a religious group. Many of these same bishops who have policies have had mandatory diocesan workshops where all diocesan personnel must attend an all-day session on how to deal with transgender people in Catholic institutions in the diocese. And the people they bring in are always these people from the Person and Identity Project. And that group mirrors the narrative. I don't know which came first, the narrative from the Person and Identity Project and the gender ideology narrative. Though that's the same. It's the same. And so that's who bishops are using, consulting with, to craft these policies that are this, what you just quoted, is, you know, for all these years, Ryan, when I hear that, I have used the term over the years, and it's strong. It's spiritual rape. It's definitely spiritual abuse. And I have known trans people for whom what the church did to them, what the hierarchy did, was spiritual rape. And this kind of policy, how can trans people, one of the big things I have tried to do over the years as a trained spiritual director, and this is not just for trans people, but for anybody who comes for spiritual direction, is to help them know the difference between the church and God. Organized religion is a vehicle, an instrument to bring us closer to God. But organized religion is not the end. God is the end. But for so many people, they can't separate what the church says from who God is. And how, if the church hates them and casts them out, well, then God hates them and casts them out. That is just, I can't help but believe that bishops, that they can't possibly understand the damage, the harm, how abusive it is to say things like that. I mean, I don't want to believe they do understand it and do it anyway.
Well, sister, let me thank you for sharing that and your own feelings about that. I want to follow up. We left it as the last question before we get to the other questions from our participants, those who are watching. Just yesterday, a document where Ryan was talking about the documents which are the policies for the local dioceses, usually about schools, but sometimes about healthcare. Yesterday, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops came out with directives for Catholic healthcare institutions, Catholic hospitals, and the like, for treating or for dealing with transgender patients. Now, you're more of an expert than I am. Can you give a brief summary, maybe, as you can, of that document, and then your response to it, what you feel about it?
Well, what they have said in the document is very much, it follows very much what they have said in other ways at other times, which is the gender ideology narrative. But they go into great detail to talk about all of those elements of gender ideology, which then leads to their conclusion that Catholic hospitals may not provide any services that have anything that have to do with transitioning. They can't provide hormones that help people transition or any transitioning surgeries. It's interesting that there was a footnote that said there are many pastoral issues, but that's not what this is. It's unfortunate. It's a very unfortunate document that really does, in a way, tie the hands of our Catholic hospitals in being able to respectfully acknowledge the reality of transgender people. But to CHA's credit, Catholic Health Association, they have been working with the bishops for a few years, trying to collaborate. And there are ways, there are ways that Catholic hospitals still can, certainly. It's the mission of Catholic hospitals to serve all people, especially marginalized communities. And so Catholic hospitals will continue to do that in the ways that they can within the parameters of what this statement said yesterday. And frankly, transgender people don't want to go to Catholic hospitals. They know they're not welcome in the Catholic Church. But the fact is that for lots of people, a Catholic hospital is their only option. They don't have a choice. And what has happened often is that when transgender people go to a Catholic hospital for something that has absolutely nothing to do with their being transgender, they go for a broken wrist. Well, it's in their records. Their birth name doesn't match their presentation, and they are not treated respectfully for medical issues that have absolutely nothing to do with their being transgender. So there's a lot that Catholic hospitals can do and want to do to be respectful and welcoming. But yesterday's statement certainly makes it harder.
Is one of the things that they can do provide counseling, or was the statement also restrictive of that?
And I think it was restrictive of that as well. I think it was. Which,
well, go ahead.
No, that's all.
Well, let's turn to some of the questions from our participants, and maybe Ryan, we can go back and forth. So I'll read the first question. This is to you, sister, from Kathy. How can we help welcome the transgender into our Catholic parishes? I worry it could do harm if they are rejected. I offered to start a support group and the pastor never responded. I know the pastor has a big heart, but he has to follow the bishop. What would you say to that question?
Well, I would quote Pope Francis that for anyone who is genuinely seeking God, they have a right and deserve to be accompanied. For those who are seeking God, we must accompany them. Yeah.
We have a question here from Lynn Kennedy Mullen, and this question touches on what has become a very controversial topic in both the church and in public life, which is how to counsel transgender youth, how to counsel people in high school and even younger who experience being transgender. And the question is, how can Catholic schools protect and support transgender students?
Yes, that is huge, and it's very complicated. As complex as this is for adults, it's much more complex for children. Children meaning anybody under 18 who does not have legal agency. I know that there are so many Catholic schools who have transgender students. They want to do the right thing. They know the students are for real, and they're very constrained by what is allowed. First, let me say this. I think that many dioceses, bishops are definitely overreacting, way overreacting with regard to kids in Catholic schools. Just to kind of, a little reality check here. This country has about 330 million people. There are about 1.5 million transgender people out of 330 million. That's less than 1%. Okay. Now, and I don't know where I got this figure, so I really can't, vouch for how accurate it is, but I did read somewhere recently, there are about maybe 300,000 transgender children. I don't know where that number would come from, but if that's true, 300,000 transgender children out of less than 1% of the entire population. Okay, so that brings transgender children to a little bitty, a lesser, of 1%. And then of those, how many are going to want to be in a Catholic school? So the point is that very, very few children, comparatively speaking, are going to be in a Catholic school. But bishops kind of act like this is Armageddon, that they're going to be just a tsunami of transgender children. There will not. And so it must be on an individual basis. Are transgender children for real? Yes, they are. But do they need guidance and support? Yes, they certainly do. But there are not nearly enough trans knowledgeable child therapists in our country now. That is a really big issue. There is such a demand, and there's not enough competent people to be guiding these children. There's no easy answer to it, but what the answer is not is a school policy. That's not the answer, because it's addressing an issue that's not there. There are going to be very few trans children. Deal with it on an individual basis with the family, with the therapist, with their faith leader.
Sister, thank you. Here's a question from Patty Robinson. It's a little long. I'm going to read it. Can't one, that's in the negative, can't one reasonably turn that doctrinal, sorry, I'm going to go back again. Can't one reasonably turn that doctrinal reasoning around and conceive that we human beings, with our notorious hubris, make the grave error of convincing ourselves that the fullest mysteries of God-given life are so easily, instantaneously revealed to our merely human eyes, thus assuming ourselves the equal of God, rather than perpetually unknowing children of a creator beyond our understanding. So,
how beautiful.
Yeah.
How beautiful is that? Amen. Amen to that.
Brian, you want to take the next question?
Sure. There's a question here from Kathy. And the question is, will Catholic hospitals refuse to use correct pronouns and names for transgender people?
That is not yet determined. You know, and again, I'm not in the healthcare system, but what I know that they will try, because not using correct names and pronouns is extremely traumatizing for people. So, but that will be a hard thing to do that kind of education awareness for so many hospitals, but they want to. I know they would want to.
Here's a more of a comment, I guess. You can respond, of course, Sister, from Andrea. I am a retired middle school teacher who does a lot of theater with children and adults, and I can't tell you how many young people are declaring themselves non-binary. They don't necessarily want to change genders so much as to be allowed not really to be either or to be both. They are not necessarily saying they're a bisexual. It is more in the presentation and the way they want to be seen.
That's correct. There is a difference between gender identity and gender expression. And that's what this comment is pointing to. And yes, there are more and more people, not just children, but adults that I know many adults who identify as non-binary, that they're not 100% female and 100% male. And that's really hard for a lot of people to wrap their heads around, but that's real too. I mean, evolution moves toward complexity, and the human person is complex. So that's for real. But it is important to keep the distinction between gender expression, how we dress, how we present, doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't mean somebody wants to have surgery and change their gender.
The question here from Jeff. Question is, the guidelines for health institutions needed to have some guidance. Is it your wish that the guidelines had declared transitioning surgery acceptable?
That's not likely to happen in Catholic hospitals. And I think that's an unwarranted worry, because those are very highly specialized surgeries. And transgender people have to go to only certain doctors can do those surgeries. So not every hospital by any means, not nearly every hospital, is competent to do their surgeries. So no, I don't think it's a realistic expectation that Catholic hospitals are going to do gender reassignment surgery. But there's so much that Catholic hospitals can do. For starters, the basis is acknowledge that transgender people are for real, that this is for real. That's the basis.
Sister, here's a question that I'm sure a lot of people have about, how to respond, from Jennifer. I greatly appreciate your sensitivity, compassion, and all of your efforts on this matter. My head breaks as well. I'm a Catholic. I was a biochemist, have been an occupational therapist, and am now also a spiritual director. I live in a region where the Archbishop has put out one of these very anti/negative policy documents. I would like to advocate more for transgender people. How would you recommend going about that best? Is letter writing to archbishops and bishops at all effective? I feel as though I've had a significant education to draw from, both from the science and from the theological sides of this issue. So people ask that question a lot, at least to me, like, what do I do?
Well, yes, right. If you want to be an ally and an advocate, if you know a transgender person, write to the bishop, definitely write to the bishop. And if your pastor says, have a conversation with your pastor. Yes, advocate for them, advocate. When in conversations, when people are saying ugly things about transgender people, speak up. Even if you think, well, I don't really know a lot about it, but speak what you know, speak that they deserve to be respected. Now, this is the perfect segue, Jim, if you don't mind. I would like to just give a shout out to the program that is now out and available that I created and facilitated. I gave it to fortunate families, It's a transgender spiritual companioning accompaniment program. You can learn more about it to go, and Jim, maybe if you all would, maybe you already have, because you know me, I don't do much computer stuff. You probably already have.
I have shared it, but we will share it again on Outreach social media platform. Tell us a little bit more about it, Sister.
Okay, I'll say a little bit more. For all these 24 years, transgender people have said to me, "Oh, Sister, are you training other nuns to do what you do? Are you training other people?" And for many multiple reasons, I couldn't. And so finally the stars lined up. And in the fall of 2021, I did a 15-week formation program with a group of 8 people. And every week was a different topic related to some aspect of the lives of transgender people. And I had a presenter, an expert presenter every week from different parts of the country. And all of it in the context of, we need to understand all of these dimensions of transgender people's lives so that we can accompany them and walk with them as a spiritual companion and advocate for them in ways that we can. So it was all taped, it's been reformatted, it's now ready to use. People are filling out applications. There are 2 tracks. The first track is for people who seriously want to take the formation course and be a spiritual companion to transgender people. That's one track. The second track is for groups, organizations, entities, parish, diocese, school, hospital, whatever, who want to learn, who want to educate themselves and their staff and personnel. And that track is a group track. And you don't have to take the whole 15. You can, if you want, you can take the ones you want. But you have to fill out an application form and be vetted and approved by fortunate families. So check it out. And that's a good way to move forward.
Sure, and that is through Fortunate Families, so they would go to the website of Fortunate Families. That's great. Thank you, Sister. We did promote it, and we'll promote it again. Ryan will ask the final, will sort of voice the final question, and then we will wrap up. So Ryan, take it away.
Sure, this question is from Ryan Fox. He writes, "It feels like the church may be on the brink of a Galileo moment, where our scientific understanding overturns our theological interpretation of Genesis and what seems like an oddly literal reading of it. Without being theologians or clergy, how can lay people legitimately question and challenge documents like yesterday's that don't seem to ring true or mesh with what we actually know about biology? Is it helpful in a pastoral context?"
You know what all theology teaches us is that God's Spirit works through all of us. And so to trust the human experience, that God is manifest in all of us. And so to trust that. And the sensus fidelium, God works through the whole church, all of us. And so how can we, how we say, trust your experience, trust the presence of God in others when you see it, trust your experience. That's valid.
Well, Sister, I think God works through all of us is a beautiful way to end. I'm going to ask you to close with a prayer, lead us in prayer at the end. But I want to thank on behalf of, first of all, I want to thank my colleague, Ryan DeCorpo, for all of his work in arranging this. Also to Jay Sen, who is our technical advisor at Outreach, for doing all the wonderful technical work behind this, arranging the Zoom call, taking care of all the wonderful graphics. Jay is responsible for the beautiful website we have. I do want to remind people that we have our Outreach 2023 conference coming up in June. Sister Luisa will be one of our valued speakers. We're so happy she's joining us again. Some of my favorite pictures last year were of Sister Luisa meeting people that she had only communicated with through the telephone or online. I really want to thank Sister personally for teaching me so much about the transgender community, for her work, her years and years of service. I think originally anonymously, or having to do it sort of under a pseudonym, to be really one of the pioneers. I do want to say, that it's very interesting for me. We have run articles about a woman named Sister Genevieve in Italy, Sister Prema in India, Sister Monica Astorga in Argentina, and of course, Sister Luisa in the United States. It's beautiful for me that women religious, the Catholic sisters, as they usually do, are leading the way in terms of ministry to those on the margins. But I just want to say thank you, Sister, for your ministry since 1999 under great duress. Thank you for caring for this group of people who are, as you say, your tears were very moving for me because you obviously love them and you feel their pain and their suffering. And just also thank you for being, in the past couple of years, a voice, a public voice through National Catholic Reporter, Global Sisters Report, and now through Outreach. We're just very grateful for what you're doing, for what you're doing on behalf of God and really on behalf of the church, even if the church isn't quite all there yet. So I'd like to invite you to close us out with a prayer, please.
Actually, I'd like to close with a blessing for us all.
Even better.
It's from a little book by one of our sisters in my community, Blessing Upon Blessing. And it's a blessing from the God of diversity. May the God of diversity be with you from east, west, north, and south. May you know God in every color and stripe. May this God instill in you a profound respect for differences in persons and their potential for revealing the true depth of richness of God's creation. May your inclusiveness gather true community around you. May the God of diversity and the God of inclusion bless us all this night. Amen.
Amen. Once again, thank you so much to Sister Luisa Derouen, the Dominican sister who works with transgender people. Thanks to Ryan DeCorpo, the managing editor of Outreach. Thanks to Jay Sen, our technical advisor. We look forward to seeing you next month with a new Outspoken. We look forward to seeing hopefully all of you in person, or many of you in person, at Outreach Conference. Continue to look at our outreach.faith website for articles about transgender issues, for some of Sister Luisa's articles, and God bless you all. Thanks so much, and good night.
Good night.